53 BCE, the Syrian desert shimmered under a sun that could kill a man as surely as any sword. 7 legions of Rome's finest infantry, 40,000 men strong, marched east across the Mesopotamian wasteland with the confidence of an empire that had never known true defeat. Leading them was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, a member of the first triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. At 60 years old, Crassus had spent a lifetime accumulating wealth that made him the Jeff Bezos of the ancient world. He owned most of Rome's real estate, commanded a private fire brigade that would only put out fires after purchasing the burning property at bargain prices, and had personally financed much of Rome's political machinery. But wealth wasn't enough. Caesar had conquered Gaul and earned military glory. Pompey had defeated the Mediterranean pirates and reorganized the East. Crassus, despite crushing Spartacus's slave rebellion years earlier, remained in their shadow. He needed a victory that would cement his legacy as a conqueror, not just a businessman in general's armour. The target was Parthia, the only major power that could rival Rome's dominance. The Parthian Empire stretched from the Euphrates River to the borders of India, controlling the lucrative Silk Road trade routes. They had gold, they had territory, and most importantly for Crassus, they had a reputation for being militarily inferior to Roman legions. Also, every Roman believed. The Roman military machine in 53 BCE represented the pinnacle of ancient warfare, or so they thought. The legionary system had conquered the Mediterranean world through discipline, engineering, and tactical flexibility that no other army could match. Each legionnaire carried a gladius, the 20-inch double-edged sword designed for stabbing in close formation, a scutum, the curved rectangular shield that interlocked with others to create an impenetrable wall, 2 pila, weighted javelins designed to penetrate shields and bend on impact to prevent reuse, and wore larica hamata chainmail armour that weighed 20 pounds but could stop most weapons of the era. The testudo formation, where shields locked overhead and on all sides creating a mobile fortress, had broken countless armies. Roman engineering built roads, bridges and siege works that allowed them to campaign in any terrain. Their discipline meant they could execute complex manoeuvres under fire that would cause other armies to dissolve into chaos. Against the Gallic tribes, the Germanic warriors, the Greek phalanxes and the African kingdoms, this system had proven unstoppable. Crassus had no reason to believe the Parthians would be any different. The intelligence reports confirmed Roman prejudices. Parthian armies relied primarily on cavalry, both heavy cataphracts armoured from head to toe and light horse archers. They had no infantry worth mentioning. They avoided pitched battles, preferring to harass and retreat. In the Roman military, doctrine that had evolved over centuries, cavalry was a supporting arm. Infantry won battles. Cavalry was useful for scouting, pursuit and flank security, but when it came to the decisive clash, disciplined heavy infantry would always prevail. It was an axiom as fundamental as gravity. What Crassus and his staff officers didn't understand, what they couldn't understand given their experience, was that the Parthians had perfected a military system specifically designed to nullify heavy infantry. They had studied Roman tactics through decades of border skirmishes. They had identified the legion's weaknesses and built an army that could exploit them without ever engaging in the kind of set-piece battle where Roman advantages would matter. Commanding the Parthian forces was Syrian, a 30-year-old general from one of Parthia's most powerful noble families. His family could field 10,000 cavalry from their own estates. He had commanded his first military campaign at 15 and had never lost a battle. While Crassus was old, wealthy, and desperate for glory, Syrian was young, brilliant, and fighting to defend his homeland. He also understood something about warfare that Romans had never needed to consider. Mobility and firepower, properly combined, could defeat any amount of armour and courage. The Parthian military system represented a completely different philosophy of warfare. Where Romans emphasized shock and staying power, Parthians emphasized mobility and standoff firepower. Their army consisted of 2 complementary types of cavalry, working in perfect coordination. The cataphracts were the heavy arm, both horse and rider encased in scale armour made of overlapping metal plates. They carried 12-foot lances and long swords. A cataphract charge could smash through most infantry formations through sheer momentum and weight. But cataphracts were expensive to equip and maintain, slow and exhausting to both horse and rider, and vulnerable if isolated or dismounted. They were the hammer, devastating but requiring perfect timing and positioning. The horse archers were the true innovation of the Parthian system. Riding smaller, faster horses bred for endurance rather than size, these warriors carried composite bows that could be fired accurately from horseback at full gallop. The composite bow was a technological marvel, laminated layers of wood, horn, and sinew that could store and release far more energy than a simple wooden bow. A Parthian composite bow could shoot an arrow with enough force to penetrate chainmail at 200 yards. Each horse archer carried 2 quivers holding 30 arrows each. Do the math. 10,000 horse archers meant 600,000 arrows in the initial ammunition load. But Sirena had added an innovation that would prove decisive. Behind the horse archers came a train of camels, each loaded with additional arrows. Thousands of camels carrying millions of arrows. The Parthians could maintain sustained fire for hours, something no other ancient army could achieve. The tactical doctrine was elegant in its simplicity. Horse archers would engage at range, never closer than 100 yards, shooting in continuous waves that kept arrows in the air constantly. They would never stand and fight, but would retreat continuously, firing backward over their shoulders in what Romans would call the Parthian shot, the maneuver that would give us the phrase parting shot. If the enemy stood still, they would be shot to pieces. If they charged, they would be led on a chase that exhausted them while arrows continued to fall. Only if the enemy became disordered and vulnerable would the cataphracts charge, smashing into broken formations with devastating effect. Against tribal armies that lacked both discipline and armour, this system was brutally effective. But Sirena believed it would work equally well against the legendary Roman legions. He would soon be proven right in the most horrifying way possible. The Roman column marched east from Syria into Mesopotamia, following the advice of Ariamnes, an Arab chieftain who supposedly supported Rome against Parthia. This first mistake would compound every subsequent error. Ariamnes was actually working for Sirena, feeding Crassus false intelligence and guiding the Roman army away from the Euphrates River and into the open desert where cavalry could operate freely, and infantry would find no terrain features to anchor their formations. Crassus's son Publius, a talented officer who had served with distinction under Julius Caesar in Gaul, advised his father to march along the river, where they would have water, supply lines, and terrain that limited cavalry mobility. Crassus dismissed this advice. The desert route was shorter, and speed would catch the Parthians before they could concentrate their forces. It was sound reasoning based on Roman experience fighting Germanic and Gallic tribes. Against a mounted army that could move 50 miles per day, it was catastrophically wrong. By the time the Roman column approached the town of Carrhae, they had been marching through desert for days. The men were tired, thirsty, and stretched out over miles of terrain. Scouts reported Parthian cavalry ahead, but Crassus received this news with satisfaction. Finally, the enemy was going to stand and fight. He ordered the legions to deploy from march column into battle formation. This was what Romans did better than anyone. Legates and tribunes shouted orders that had been practiced countless times. The column sections wheeled and expanded, cohorts moved into assigned positions, gaps closed, and within 20 minutes, 40,000 men stood in perfect formation ready for battle. The classic deployment was a checkerboard pattern called quincunx, 3 lines with gaps between units that allowed flexibility and mutual support. But Crassus, seeing the Parthian cavalry spread across a wide front, made a fateful decision. He formed the army into a massive square, infantry on all 4 sides, baggage and cavalry in the centre. This formation couldn't be flanked and presented a uniform front in all directions. Against cavalry that might circle and attack from any angle, it seemed logical. What it actually did was create exactly the static, immobile formation that Sirena's tactics were designed to destroy. The legions stood in their square watching the Parthian army approach across the desert plain. The Romans had expected to see a small force of cavalry scouts. Instead, the horizon filled with horsemen. Thousands upon thousands of cavalry appeared, first as a shimmer in the heat, then as distinct masses of moving horses, then as individual warriors whose armour reflected the sun like mirrors, and the sound. At first it was barely audible, a distant rumble like thunder. As the Parthians drew closer, the sound grew into a thundering cacophony that Roman veterans who survived would describe in their nightmares for decades. The Parthians were beating drums, huge war drums mounted on camels that produced a deep booming rhythm that could be felt in the chest. Combined with the thunder of thousands of hooves, it created a wall of noise that made communication difficult and nerves fray. Surena's cavalry deployed in a vast crescent formation that seemed to stretch forever in both directions. The wings extended far beyond the Roman flanks, threatening to encircle the entire army. In the centre, partially obscured by dust and heat shimmer, stood Surena himself under a banner that would become infamous. The Parthian general had staged a bit of psychological warfare. He had initially dressed his cataphracts in plain brown cloaks that hid their armour. Now, at a signal, thousands of warriors threw off their cloaks simultaneously, revealing scale armour that caught the sun in a blinding flash of light. The effect on Roman morale was immediate and profound. Veterans who had faced Celtic berserkers and Germanic warriors without flinching felt their blood run cold. The ancient historian Plutarch, writing a century later from survivor accounts, described the moment. The Romans were startled by the splendour and magnificence of the Parthian armour. Surena's armour was of the most radiant gold, adorned with silk and jewels. The armour of those around him glittered like fire with polished steel and brass. The Romans had expected barbarian cavalry. What they saw was a professional army equipped and organised as well as they were, just configured for a completely different style of warfare. Crassus ordered his men to ready weapons. Pila were gripped, shields raised, gladi loosened in scabbards. The legionaries prepared for what they expected would be a cavalry charge that they would receive in formation, absorb the impact, and then butcher the horsemen who couldn't manoeuvre in the press of bodies. The order to charge never came. Instead, at 200 yards distance, the Parthian horse archers began to shoot. The sky turned black with arrows. Not an exaggeration, not poetic license, but a literal description of what 10,000 composite bows releasing simultaneously looked like. Each archer could shoot 10 to 12 aim shots per minute. That meant 100,000 arrows every 60 seconds. The arrows rose in clouds that actually darkened the sun, arced at the top of their trajectory and fell like steel rain onto the Roman formation. The legionaries raised their shields in the practiced motion that had protected Roman soldiers for generations, against javelins, against sling stones, against the arrows of Gallic and Germanic archers. The scutum was excellent protection. Its curved shape deflected projectiles, its layered wood construction absorbed impacts, and its size covered most of a man's body. Against Parthian composite bows at 200 yards, shields worked, but barely. The arrows hit with enough force to punch through the wooden shield, through the chainmail behind it, and into flesh. Not every arrow, the majority were stopped or deflected, but enough. Out of every volley of 100,000 arrows, perhaps 5,000 found targets. 5,000 men hit every minute. Most wounds weren't immediately fatal. An arrow through the thigh, through the forearm, through the shoulder, these were survivable injuries. But they removed men from the fighting line. A legionary with an arrow through his shield arm couldn't hold his scutum properly. One with an arrow in his leg couldn't maintain formation. The wounded didn't die immediately. They screamed, they called for help. They degraded unit cohesion as friends tried to assist them. And the arrows never stopped. Wave after wave, minute after minute, the steel rain fell. What made it truly horrifying was the Parthian tactical system. The horse archers would shoot their load of 60 arrows in about 5 minutes, then ride back to the camel train, grab fresh quivers, and return to the line. The rotation was continuous. There was always a line of archers shooting. The volume of fire never slackened. The Roman centurions, the professional backbone of the legions, recognized the danger. This wasn't a battle, it was an execution. They shouted for permission to advance, to charge the Parthian line and bring this to the close combat, where Roman superiority in armour and weapons would decide the outcome. Crassus gave the order. The Roman front ranks charged with the discipline that had conquered the known world. Shields up, formations tight, they advanced at the run toward the Parthian line. The horse archers retreated, continuing to shoot as they withdrew. This was the Parthian drill practiced until it was instinctive. Never fight close, never let the enemy engage, always maintain distance and keep shooting. The Romans chased them for 400 yards, then 600, then 800. The distance from the main formation grew. The tight ranks began to loosen as faster men pulled ahead and exhausted soldiers fell behind. And still the arrows fell. Men stumbled and fell, creating gaps in the line. Others had to slow or go around, creating more disorder. What had been a disciplined Roman advance became a crowd of armoured men gasping for breath in the desert heat, strung out over hundreds of yards, their formation dissolving. This was the moment Serena had been waiting for. From the flanks, hidden until now by dust and distance, the cataphracts charged. 1,000 armoured horsemen on armoured horses, each carrying a 12-foot lance, hit the disordered Roman line like a metal avalanche. The impact was catastrophic. Lances designed to be used from horseback at full gallop had incredible penetrating power. They punched through shields, through chainmail, through the body behind, often spitting 2 men on a single shaft. The horses themselves were weapons, half a ton of armoured flesh moving at 30 miles per hour that simply ran over anyone in their path. The Romans who had been chasing the horse archers suddenly found themselves attacked from the side by heavy cavalry, while arrows continued to pour in from ahead. They tried to form testudo, the defensive formation that had saved Roman forces countless times. In the testudo, shields locked together overhead and on all sides, creating a shell that could protect against missiles. Against arrows falling from above, it worked. Men hunched under their shields in tight clusters, relatively safe from the arrow storm, but the testudo was a static defensive formation. Men inside couldn't move quickly, couldn't see well, couldn't fight effectively. They could only endure and hope for relief. The cataphracts found the testudo formations and destroyed them methodically. The 12-foot lances could reach between shields and into the packed mass of men. The horses would rear and bring their armoured hooves down on shields, smashing them and the arms holding them. Once a testudo broke, the men inside were helpless, packed too tightly to use weapons, vulnerable to the lances and swords of the cataphracts. The slaughter was intimate and thorough. Publius Crassus, commanding the Roman left wing with the 300 Gallic cavalry he had brought from Julius Caesar's legions, recognized that his father's army was being destroyed piecemeal. The only chance was to break the Parthian archer line and force them into close combat, where their archery would be useless. He requested permission to lead a flying column to scatter the horse archers. Crassus, watching his legions being shot to pieces and desperate for any offensive action, gave his approval. This decision would haunt him for the few remaining hours of his life. Publius took 1,300 Gallic cavalry, 4,000 infantry and 500 archers, about 6,000 men total, and charged toward the Parthian right wing. The horse archers retreated before him as they had before, but this time they retreated faster and farther, leading him away from the main Roman formation. The Gallic cavalry, bred for speed and courage, pursued with enthusiasm. These were some of the finest horsemen in Europe, veterans of Caesar's Gallic campaigns, confident in their ability to ride down any enemy. They chased the Parthians for 2 miles, then 3, then 4. The Parthian retreat seemed like panic. Men were throwing away weapons, saddles were slipping, horses were stumbling. The chase went on so long that Publius began to suspect a trap, but by then it was too late. The Parthian horse archers stopped retreating. In seconds, a pursuit became an encirclement. The Gallic cavalry suddenly found themselves surrounded by 4,000 horse archers, who began shooting from all directions simultaneously. The volume of arrows was apocalyptic. The Gauls had light armour compared to Roman legionaries. Arrows that might have been stopped by scutum and lorica hamata went through Celtic shields and leather armour like they were paper. Men and horses were hit by multiple arrows. A horse with 3 arrows in its chest would rear, throw its rider and collapse. A Gallic warrior would take arrows in the arm, the side, the leg, and fall from his dying horse to be trampled by other panicking animals. The Gallic cavalry, which moments before had been pursuing confidently, disintegrated in minutes. Riderless horses stampeded in all directions. Wounded men tried to crawl away from the killing zone. The survivors tried to rally around Publius and the Roman infantry who had managed to form a defensive circle. But there was no defence against what the Parthians were doing. The horse archers circled the Roman position just out of spear range, shooting continuously. The Roman archers tried to return fire, but they had only 500 men against 4,000, and they didn't have the camel train supplying endless ammunition. Within 20 minutes, most Roman archers were dead or wounded, and their ammunition exhausted. Publius's infantry formed testudo and tried to endure. The arrows found every gap, every moment when a shield shifted, every face that looked up to see the enemy. Men died from arrows through the eye slit, through the gap between shield and helmet, through the armpit when they raised their arm to throw a javelin. The lucky ones died fast. The unlucky took multiple wounds and bled out slowly while their comrades could do nothing but watch. Publius himself was wounded multiple times. An arrow through his sword hand made it impossible to hold a weapon. Another through his side was probably mortal, though not immediately fatal. He could see his command being annihilated around him. Men were begging their officers to lead a charge, any action being preferable to standing still and dying. But there was nowhere to charge. The Parthians were never closer than 50 yards, always moving, impossible to bring to close combat. Finally, recognizing that his position was hopeless and his continued existence was causing his men to die for nothing, Publius Crassus made his final decision. He ordered his armor-bearer to kill him. The man, probably a slave from Publius's household who had served him for years, refused. Publius couldn't do it himself with his wounded hand. So he drew his dagger with his left hand and walked into the Parthian arrow storm until enough hits brought him down. His death released his surviving soldiers from their duty. Those who could still move surrendered. The Parthians accepted their capitulation and then killed them anyway. This wasn't Roman custom where prisoners were valuable for ransom or slaves. This was Eastern warfare where defeated enemies were simply eliminated. Of the 6,000 men who rode out with Publius, perhaps 500 survived as prisoners. The rest lay in heaps where they had stood, looking like pincushions, some bodies with 20 or 30 arrows in them. Surena's men cut off Publius's head and mounted it on a spear. Then they rode back toward the main battlefield, arriving just as Marcus Crassus was beginning to hope his son had succeeded in breaking the Parthian line. The old man saw Parthian cavalry approaching at a gallop carrying a spear. On the spear was something round. As they got closer, Crassus could make out features. The face was young, patrician, familiar. For a moment his mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. Then recognition came with the force of a physical blow. The Parthians rode along the Roman line displaying the head, taunting the legionaries in broken Latin, calling for Crassus to send his wife to mourn at their son's funeral. The psychological impact was devastating. Publius had been popular with the men. His death proved that Roman valour and tactics couldn't overcome the Parthian system. If 6,000 men, including elite cavalry, couldn't break through, what hope did the rest have? Crassus, who had been barely maintaining control of the battle, seemed to break. Contemporary accounts describe him as being in shock, unable to give coherent orders, staring at his son's head with an expression of absolute horror. The centurions had to take control, pulling the legions back in fighting retreat toward Carrhae. The Parthians harassed them every step, shooting continuously. The Romans would form testudo, move a few hundred yards, stop to rest and reform, then move again. Each stop meant more casualties as arrows fell on the static formations. Each movement meant more casualties as gaps appeared in the shield wall. The wounded were left behind. There was no way to carry them and maintain formation. Men with arrows through the leg begged their comrades not to leave them. The healthy had no choice. Stay and die, or march and maybe survive. The abandoned wounded were killed by Parthian cavalry, who swept through after the legions passed. The retreat took all day. By the time the surviving Romans reached Carrhae's walls, they had lost over 20,000 men, 20,000 dead without ever engaging in the close combat where Roman advantages would matter. The Parthians had barely lost 100. It was the most lopsided defeat Rome had suffered in over a century. Inside Carrhae's walls, the surviving Romans collapsed from exhaustion, thirst, and trauma. Many wounded men died during the night from blood loss and shock. Crassus remained in his tent, refusing to see anyone, mourning his son and his destroyed reputation. The senior officers held a council. Their situation was hopeless. They were 150 miles inside enemy territory with no supplies, no reinforcements, and an enemy that could prevent them from moving in any direction. The Parthians didn't even need to assault the walls. They could just wait for thirst and starvation to do their work. The decision was made to attempt a night retreat towards Syria. If they could reach the mountains before the Parthians caught them, the terrain would neutralize the cavalry advantage, and they might fight their way to safety. It was a slim hope, but the only one they had. That night, under cover of darkness, the Romans slipped out of Carrhae and began marching west. The march was a nightmare of confusion and fear. Units became separated in the dark. Wounded men who couldn't keep pace were abandoned. The column stretched over miles of desert, with no one certain of the route or how far they had to go before daylight exposed them. By dawn, Serena's scouts had located the Roman column. The pursuit began immediately. The Romans tried to reach a range of hills visible in the distance where they could take defensive positions. The Parthians prevented this with a simple tactic. They attacked the rear of the column. The Roman rearguard had to stop and form defensive formation to avoid being overrun. This stopped the entire column. While the rear fought, the Parthians sent cavalry around the flanks to attack the middle and front sections. The Roman column broke into isolated pockets, each surrounded by horse archers, each being systematically destroyed. Crassus's group, perhaps 10,000 survivors, managed to reach a low hill and form a defensive perimeter. Surena approached under a flag of truce. He offered terms. If Crassus would meet with him personally to negotiate, he would allow the Romans safe passage to Syria. The officers advised Crassus not to trust Parthian guarantees, but Crassus, broken by his son's death and the destruction of his army, agreed. Perhaps he hoped to sacrifice himself to save his men. Perhaps he no longer cared about his own survival. He walked down the hill with his senior officers toward the Parthian lines. What happened next is disputed by ancient sources. Some say Surena intended to capture Crassus alive to parade him in triumph through Parthian cities. Some say the Parthians meant to kill him from the start. Some say it was an accident when Roman and Parthian soldiers scuffled. What's clear is that violence erupted. Crassus's officers were cut down. Crassus himself was killed, either by a Parthian soldier or by his own men who preferred to see him dead rather than captured. The man who had been the richest in Rome, who had stood equal with Caesar and Pompey, died in the dirt of a Syrian hillside, his army destroyed, his son dead, his quest for glory ending in absolute catastrophe. According to Plutarch and other historians, the Parthians poured molten gold into Crassus's mouth after death, a symbolic gesture. This was the wealth you craved. Drink deeply. Whether this actually happened or is propaganda, it captured the perception. Rome's greed and arrogance had been punished by a superior military system that Roman pride had failed to respect. With Crassus dead, the remaining Roman forces collapsed. Some units surrendered and were enslaved. Some managed to escape in small groups and eventually reached Roman territory. Of the 40,000 men who had marched into Mesopotamia, approximately 10,000 returned to Syria. 20,000 were dead. 10,000 were prisoners who would be marched to the eastern edges of the Parthian Empire, some ending up as far as the borders of China, their descendants possibly serving as mercenaries in Chinese armies centuries later, though this remains speculative. The Battle of Carrhae stands as one of history's most complete military disasters. A professional army led by a competent general in good morale and fully equipped was destroyed by an enemy force roughly equal in size through tactical superiority alone. The Romans lost because every assumption they held about warfare was invalidated. They assumed infantry superiority would prevail. They assumed that disciplined heavy infantry could defeat cavalry through holding formation and waiting for the enemy to close. They assumed that arrows were harassment weapons that could be endured until the real fighting began. They were wrong on every count. The Parthians had developed a military system specifically designed to fight without closing to infantry combat. They had the mobility to refuse battle on Roman terms, the firepower to inflict continuous casualties at range, and the logistics to maintain this firepower indefinitely. The camel train carrying arrows was the key innovation that turned harassment into annihilation. The psychological impact on Rome was profound. The invincible legions had been destroyed. The eastern frontier, which Romans had assumed they could expand at will, was suddenly a hard limit. For the next 250 years, Rome and Parthia would fight repeatedly, but Rome never again attempted to conquer Parthia proper. The border remained roughly where it was in 53 BCE. Carrhae taught military theorists lessons that remained relevant for centuries. Mobility and firepower could defeat armour and discipline. Logistics, the unglamorous work of supply, could be as important as tactics. An enemy that refused to fight on your terms and had the means to impose their own terms couldn't be defeated through courage and tradition alone. The specific tactical problem, how does heavy infantry defeat mounted archers, would reappear throughout history. Medieval European knights faced similar challenges against Turkish and Mongol horse archers. The answer, when one was found, involved combined arms, using your own cavalry to pin the horse archers in place while, infantry advanced, or using terrain that limited cavalry mobility. The Romans eventually developed these solutions, but too late for Crassus. For the Parthians, Carrhae was a warning to Rome that the East would not be conquered easily. Surena himself didn't survive to enjoy his victory. King Orodes II of Parthia, nervous about a general who had become too successful and too popular, had him executed within a year. But the military system Surena had perfected would defend Parthia for centuries. The composite bow, the horse archer tactics, the integration of light and heavy cavalry, these would influence warfare throughout Central Asia and the Middle East for over 1,000 years. The survivors of Carrhae who made it back to Rome told stories that became legendary. The sky turning black with arrows, the thunder of Parthian drums, the cataphracts appearing like golden ghosts through the dust. These images haunted Roman consciousness. When later emperors contemplated eastern campaigns, senators would invoke the name of Crassus as a warning. The desert held 20,000 Roman dead as testimony to what happened when arrogance met competence. In 20 BCE, Emperor Augustus negotiated the return of the legionary eagles captured at Carrhae. This was considered a major diplomatic victory, worthy of celebration throughout the empire. The standards were placed in the Temple of Mars altar, the Avenger, where they remained as memorial to the worst defeat Roman arms had suffered. Modern archaeology has searched for the battlefield without definitive success. The desert keeps its secrets, but the historical accounts are clear enough to reconstruct what happened with reasonable accuracy. The numbers vary slightly between sources, but the outline is consistent. A Roman army marched east expecting easy victory and was systematically destroyed by an enemy that fought in ways they didn't understand and couldn't counter. The lesson of Carrhae echoes across military history. Technical and tactical superiority matters more than tradition and courage. An army that refuses to fight on your terms and has the capability to impose their own terms is nearly impossible to defeat. Logistics and supply, the boring details that generals hate to think about, can determine battles as surely as valour and skill. Most importantly, arrogance and underestimation of your enemy is a force multiplier for the other side. Marcus Licinius Crassus marched into the desert with supreme confidence in Roman superiority. He died there, along with his son and 20,000 legionaries, because that confidence was misplaced. The Parthians weren't primitive cavalry barbarians. They were professionals with a sophisticated military system specifically designed to counter Roman infantry. When those horse archers began shooting and the sky turned black with arrows, the Romans learned a lesson that military forces throughout history have had to learn repeatedly. Your enemy gets a vote in how the battle is fought, and if they vote for a kind of warfare you're not prepared for, all your tradition and training won't save you. The thunder of hooves and the whistle of arrows, that was the last sound 20,000 Romans heard. Carrhae was Rome's reminder that empires aren't invincible, that every system has weaknesses, and that the price of arrogance is paid in blood in the desert sand. The immediate aftermath of Carrhae sent shockwaves through the Roman political system that would contribute to the collapse of the Republic itself. Crassus's death removed one leg of the first triumvirate, the unofficial alliance between Crassus, Pompey and Julius Caesar that had dominated Roman politics for nearly a decade. With Crassus gone, the delicate balance of power collapsed. Caesar and Pompey, no longer held in check by their mutual partner, began the slide towards civil war that would end the Republic and birth the Empire. In Rome, the news arrived like a thunderbolt. The Senate, which had authorized Crassus's expedition with barely concealed enthusiasm, now scrambled to distance themselves from the disaster. Senators who had praised the campaign as a necessary expansion of Roman power now claimed they had always doubted the wisdom of Eastern adventures. Political enemies of Crassus used the defeat to attack his memory, claiming he had been motivated purely by greed and personal glory rather than Roman interests. They weren't entirely wrong, but the hypocrisy was breathtaking given that many of these same men had financially benefited from Crassus's loans and political support. The common people of Rome reacted with genuine shock and grief. 20,000 citizens dead, an entire generation of young men from hundreds of Roman and Italian families simply gone. The traditional mourning period was extended. Women wore black throughout the city. Theatres closed. Public games were cancelled. The catastrophe touched virtually every neighbourhood in Rome. Some streets had lost every military-age man to the Syrian desert. But beneath the mourning ran a current of fear. If Rome's legions could be destroyed so completely, what did that mean for the empire's security? The Gallic tribes had been defeated. The Germanic peoples were pushed back across the Rhine. The Mediterranean was a Roman lake. But now, suddenly, the eastern frontier was vulnerable. What if the Parthians didn't stop at their borders? What if they invaded Syria, Judea, even Asia Minor? For the first time in generations, Romans contemplated the possibility of foreign invasion of Roman territory. These fears were not immediately realised, partly because Parthia was itself politically unstable. King Orodes II, having executed Surenna, faced rebellions and succession disputes that occupied his attention. The Parthians were content to have defended their territory and didn't seriously attempt to invade Roman Syria. But the fear remained, colouring Roman strategic thinking for centuries. The military lessons of Carrhae were studied, intensely by Roman commanders who understood they might face similar challenges. The key problem was clear enough. How do you bring mounted archers to close combat when they can retreat faster than infantry, can advance and shoot while retreating? The Romans developed several responses over the following decades. First, they dramatically increased the ratio of cavalry in eastern legions. Roman armies that fought in the east after Carrhae typically included large contingent of auxiliary cavalry, often recruited from allied peoples who had cavalry traditions. These mounted units could screen the infantry and pursue horse archers, forcing them to fight other cavalry, rather than simply shooting infantry at will. Second, Roman commanders learned to use terrain aggressively. Battles were forced near rivers, hills, forests, anywhere that limited cavalry mobility. Roman generals became experts at refusing battle in open terrain and manoeuvring to force engagements where geography favoured infantry. If the Parthians wanted a battle, they would have to fight on ground that neutralised their advantages. Third, Rome invested heavily in its own archery capabilities. The traditional Roman view that archery was a support weapon for barbarians and auxiliaries began to shift. Eastern legions included larger numbers of archers, often Syrian or Cretan specialists. Some legions even trained regular infantry in archery, creating hybrid units that could return fire against horse archers while maintaining heavy infantry capabilities. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Roman logistics adapted to eastern conditions. Armies operating in Mesopotamia travelled with extensive supply trains that included food, water, and crucially ammunition for their own missile troops. The lesson of the camel train was learned. Sustained firepower required sustained supply. But these adaptations took time, and in the immediate aftermath of Carrhae, the eastern frontier was genuinely vulnerable. The Roman garrisons in Syria were demoralised and under strength. The surviving soldiers from Carrhae were traumatised. Many suffered from what we would now recognise as post-traumatic stress disorder. Ancient sources describe veterans who would panic at the sound of drums or the sight of dust clouds on the horizon. Some refused to serve in eastern postings, requesting transfers to Gaul or Germania, where they would face enemies they understood. The governor of Syria, Gaius Cassius Longinus, the same man who would later be one of Julius Caesar's assassinators, performed admirably in stabilising the frontier. With minimal forces and facing possible Parthian invasion, Cassius managed to defeat several Parthian probing attacks and convinced Orodes that invading Roman Syria would be more costly than it was worth. His defensive success prevented Carrhae from becoming an even larger catastrophe. But the psychological wound to Roman prestige was deep. For centuries, Romans had believed in the inherent superiority of their military system. They had conquered the Mediterranean world through discipline, engineering, and tactical flexibility. Defeat was possible, even occasionally necessary to teach lessons, but complete annihilation of a professional army was supposed to be impossible. Carrhae proved it wasn't. The defeat also had diplomatic consequences across the eastern Mediterranean. Client kingdoms and allied cities that had relied on Roman protection suddenly questioned whether Rome could actually defend them. Some began sending diplomatic missions to Parthia, hedging their bets. Others increased their own military forces, no longer trusting Roman legions to provide security. The careful diplomatic network that Rome had built in the east over a century began to fray. Julius Caesar, watching from Gaul where he was completing his conquest, understood the implications immediately. In his commentaries and private letters, he referenced Carrhae as an example of what happened when a commander underestimated his enemy and failed to adapt tactics to circumstances. Caesar would never make Crassus's mistakes. His military genius lay partly in his willingness to learn from others' failures and adapt his methods to each enemy. When Caesar later contemplated his own Parthian campaign, he planned it with meticulous attention to the lessons of Carrhae. He would bring massive cavalry forces, overwhelmingly superior numbers, and supplies for an extended campaign. He would avoid open desert battles and force engagements near rivers, where his engineering could create fortified positions. The campaign would have been Rome's response to Carrhae, a demonstration that Roman military science could solve any tactical problem. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE ended those plans before they could be tested. The Roman prisoners taken at Carrhae faced a fate that was in some ways worse than death. 10,000 men were marched east across the Parthian Empire to the frontier provinces along the Oxus River, near modern Afghanistan. There they were settled as military colonists, expected to defend Parthia's eastern border against nomadic raids. These were Roman citizens and Italian allies, soldiers who had survived the battle only to be exiled thousands of miles from home with no possibility of return. Some ancient sources claim that these Roman prisoners and their descendants eventually ended up in China. A Chinese historical text from the 1st century BCE mentions a group of soldiers fighting in a fish-scale formation, similar to the Roman testudo serving as mercenaries along China's western frontier. Modern historians debate whether these could have been descendants of Carrhae survivors. The evidence is intriguing but not conclusive. If true, it would mean that some Roman soldiers ended up fighting on the edges of the Chinese Empire, about as far from Rome as it was possible to get. Their descendants might have intermarried with local populations, their Roman identity, gradually dissolving into the mixing of cultures along the Silk Road. It's a haunting image, survivors of Rome's greatest defeat becoming nameless mercenaries in Chinese service, the testudo formation that had failed them at Carrhae, being used to fight nomadic horsemen on the frontiers of another empire entirely. Back in Rome, the political consequences of Carrhae continued to unfold. The alliance between Caesar and Pompey, already strained, collapsed completely. With Crassus gone, there was no mediator, no third party to balance their competing ambitions. The two most powerful men in Rome maneuvered for supreme power, and by 49 BCE they were at war. The civil war that followed killed far more Romans than Carrhae had, but it was Crassus's death that removed the political structure preventing it. In a very real sense, the Parthian arrows at Carrhae killed not just 20,000 legionaries but the Roman Republic itself. The echo of drums and the whistle of arrows set in motion political forces that would transform Rome from a republic into an empire. When Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir, finally established the imperial system after defeating Mark Antony, one of his first priorities was resolving the Parthian question. He couldn't afford another Carrhae. The new empire needed secure frontiers, and the east remained dangerously unstable. Augustus chose diplomacy over war, negotiating a treaty with Parthia in 20 BCE that established a clear border and returned the captured legion standards. The negotiation itself was a masterpiece of propaganda. Augustus claimed he had forced Parthia to return the eagles through the implicit threat of military force. In reality, it was a diplomatic exchange where both sides gained face. Parthia got recognition of their sovereignty and borders. Rome got back the symbols of their humiliation, which could be spun as a victory. The standards were paraded through Rome in triumph, placed in the new Temple of Mars altar, and Augustus had coins minted showing a Parthian handing over the eagles to a Roman soldier. The message was clear. The humiliation of Carrhae had been avenged, if not militarily, then diplomatically. Roman honour was restored. The actual veterans of Carrhae, those few who had survived and made it home, probably saw through the propaganda. But for the broader Roman public, the return of the standards closed the wound that Carrhae had opened. Rome could pretend that the defeat had been avenged, that Roman superiority was reaffirmed. It was psychologically necessary fiction for an empire that couldn't acknowledge the possibility of permanent defeat. Subsequent Roman emperors would fight repeatedly with Parthia over the following centuries. Trajan invaded Mesopotamia in 115 CE and briefly conquered the Parthian capital. Marcus Aurelius fought successful campaigns in the 160s CE. Septimius Severus invaded in 187 CE. These campaigns had mixed results, some successful, some disastrous, but none achieved permanent conquest of Parthia. The frontier remained roughly where it had been after Carrhae. Rome and Parthia were evenly matched powers that could hurt each other, but not decisively defeat each other. The military balance that Carrhae had established, where Roman infantry and Parthian cavalry each had advantages in specific circumstances, persisted. Battles were won and lost by both sides, but the strategic stalemate continued. Eventually Parthia fell to internal rebellion and was replaced by the Sassanid Persian Empire in 224 CE. The Sassanids continued the same military traditions, heavy cavalry and horse archers, the same tactical systems that had destroyed Crassus. Rome would fight Persia for another 400 years with the same inconclusive results. The eastern frontier remained Rome's permanent strategic challenge. The broader military lessons of Carrhae extended far beyond the specific Roman-Parthian conflict. Throughout history, variations of the same tactical problem have appeared. At Adrianople in 378 CE, Roman legions were destroyed by Gothic cavalry in a battle that eerily echoed Carrhae. A Roman army was caught in open terrain by mobile mounted forces and annihilated. The Eastern Roman Empire never fully recovered from Adrianople, just as the Republic never fully recovered from Carrhae. In medieval Europe, knights repeatedly discovered that mounted archers were nightmarishly difficult opponents. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century saw European heavy cavalry defeated again and again by tactics descended directly from the Parthian system. Horse archers would retreat before charges, shoot continuously, and refuse close combat until the enemy was exhausted and disordered. The Battle of Liegnitz in 1241, where a Mongol army destroyed a Polish-German force, followed almost exactly the same pattern as Carrhae. Even in the age of firearms, the fundamental problem persisted. How do you bring to battle an enemy who can hurt you at range and retreat faster than you can pursue? Cavalry armed with carbines in the 17th and 18th centuries used remarkably similar tactics to Parthian horse archers. The solution eventually came from technological change, not tactical innovation. Firearms with longer range and faster reload times eventually made mounted archery obsolete. But for over 1500 years, from Carrhae to the early modern period, the tactical system Surenna had perfected remained viable. The human cost of Carrhae extended far beyond the immediate casualties. The 20,000 men who died in the desert left behind families, children who grew up without fathers, wives who became widows, parents who lost sons. In a society without social safety nets, these families often faced poverty and hardship. Some were supported by their communities or by remaining family members, others fell into destitution. The Roman government provided no death benefits or pensions. The legionaries had been promised plunder from Parthia that would make them rich. Instead, their families got nothing but grief. The 10,000 prisoners who were marched to the eastern edge of Parthia left families who didn't even have bodies to mourn. For years, decades even, some families probably hoped their men might somehow return. They never did. Those soldiers disappeared into the vastness of the Parthian Empire and never saw Rome again. Their children grew up with father-shaped holes in their lives. Their wives either remarried or lived as widows. Their parents died never knowing what had happened to their sons. The psychological impact on Roman military culture was profound. Before Carrhae, there was an assumption of inevitable victory. Romans might lose battles, but they would win wars through persistence and superior organization. Carrhae shattered that assumption. It proved that Roman armies could be not just defeated, but annihilated by an enemy with superior tactics. This realization made Roman commanders more cautious, but also more realistic. The post-Carrhae Roman military was more willing to learn from enemies, to adopt foreign tactics and equipment, to acknowledge that Rome didn't have all the answers. In a perverse way, Carrhae might have made Rome stronger by puncturing their arrogance. The German tribes beyond the Rhine learned from Rome's example and adopted some Roman military techniques. The Parthians learned from Carrhae that Rome could be beaten but would always come back, making permanent conquest of Roman territory impractical. The great empires of the ancient world learned to respect each other's military power and generally avoided existential conflicts. The battlefield itself, somewhere in the desert near Carrhae, became a haunted place in Roman imagination. Ancient sources describe it as cursed ground where ghosts of the slain could be seen on certain nights. Whether these were genuine beliefs or literary devices, they reflected the trauma the battle had inflicted on Roman consciousness. For generations, the name Carrhae was synonymous with disaster, a cautionary tale told to young officers about the price of arrogance and incompetence. In Parthian culture, Carrhae became a legendary victory, proof of Parthian military superiority and the effectiveness of their tactical system. Surena, despite his execution, was remembered as a hero. The battle was celebrated in poems and songs. Kings invoked Carrhae when they wanted to inspire their armies or intimidate Roman ambassadors. The memory of the battle served both empires, teaching Romans caution and giving Parthians confidence. The long-term strategic impact was a stable frontier that neither side could decisively shift. This stability, ironically, might have been better for both empires than if either had decisively conquered the other. A frontier in constant low-level conflict forced both sides to maintain military readiness and border defences, but it wasn't so threatening that it required total mobilisation. The Roman-Parthian frontier became a permanent feature of ancient geopolitics, a line across the Middle East that defined the limits of both empires. Modern military theorists still study Carrhae as a case study in several important principles. The danger of underestimating enemies based on prejudice rather than accurate intelligence. The importance of combined arms and tactical flexibility. The reality that mobility and firepower can defeat armour and discipline if properly employed. The necessity of adapting tactics to terrain and enemy capabilities rather than imposing a preferred method of fighting. The critical role of logistics and supply in sustained operations. These lessons remain relevant in contemporary warfare. The US military's experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan included elements reminiscent of Carrhae. Conventional forces optimized for set-piece battles against similar opponents struggled against irregular forces using mobility and standoff attacks. The solution, then as now, required adapting tactics, incorporating local allies, using appropriate technology, and acknowledging that the enemy's way of war might be effective even if it doesn't match your own doctrines. The archaeological search for the battlefield continues sporadically. The general location near modern Harran in southern Turkey is known, but the specific site where 20,000 Romans died has never been definitively identified. The desert has moved over centuries. Ancient water sources have dried up. Battlefields without permanent structures or mass graves are notoriously difficult to locate archaeologically. Perhaps someday excavations will uncover the physical evidence, Roman equipment and weapons, Parthian arrowheads, the bones of men and horses. Until then, Carrhae exists primarily in the historical record, in the accounts of Plutarch and Cassius Dio and other ancient historians who preserve the story for future generations. Those accounts, written decades or centuries after the battle by authors who never witnessed it personally, have their limitations. Ancient historians sometimes exaggerated numbers, invented speeches and shaped narratives to make moral points, but the core facts of Carrhae are consistent across multiple independent sources. A Roman army commanded by Crassus was destroyed by Parthian forces under Surena. The defeat was comprehensive and resulted from tactical and strategic failures. The psychological and political impact on Rome was severe and long-lasting. These facts are as well established as anything from ancient history. The human dimension of Carrhae, the experience of individual soldiers in that desert hell, can only be imagined. What was it like to stand in formation under the Syrian sun with arrows falling continuously, watching comrades die, knowing you were trapped with no hope of victory or escape? The discipline that kept Roman legionaries in formation under those circumstances was extraordinary. Most armies would have broken and run, which would have led to even greater slaughter. That the Romans maintained formation for hours while being shot to pieces testifies to their training and courage. But discipline and courage weren't enough. Against an enemy who refused close combat and had the mobility and firepower to maintain standoff attacks indefinitely, traditional military virtues were insufficient. The Parthians had solved the tactical equation. They had created a military system specifically designed to defeat heavy infantry, without ever engaging in the close combat where infantry advantages would matter. This was brilliant military innovation, as significant in its way as the Roman Manipular Legion, or the Macedonian Phalanx. For the individual Roman soldier at Carrhae, this innovation meant death in the desert far from home, killed by an enemy he couldn't reach, fighting in a battle he couldn't win, led by commanders who didn't understand what they were facing. 20,000 men paid with their lives for their leaders' arrogance and ignorance. That is the true tragedy of Carrhae, a preventable disaster that resulted from underestimating the enemy and overestimating Roman capabilities. Marcus Licinius Crassus wanted glory and got annihilation. Publius Crassus wanted to save his father's army and got his head on a spear. 20,000 legionaries wanted to go home and got arrows instead. The Parthian victory at Carrhae stands as one of the most complete tactical triumphs in military history. Against a numerically equal or superior enemy, on terrain that offered no significant advantages, using a tactical system that maximised their strengths and exploited enemy weaknesses, Surena's army achieved what every general dreams of: the complete destruction of an enemy force at minimal cost to their own side. That this was accomplished against Rome, the dominant military power of the age, made it all the more remarkable. The sky turned black with arrows that day in 53 BCE. When it cleared, Rome had learned that confidence without competence is just arrogance waiting to be punished. The lesson cost 20,000 lives. The survivors carried that lesson back to Rome, where it would influence Roman strategy for centuries. Never again would Rome so casually assume victory over Eastern opponents. The thunder of Parthian drums, the whistle of arrows, the screams of dying men, these sounds echoed through Roman consciousness long after the physical sounds had faded. Carrhae became shorthand for disaster, a battle whose name itself conveyed warning. When later emperors contemplated Eastern campaigns, their advisors would invoke Carrhae. When generals faced tactical challenges, they would study Carrhae to understand what not to do. The battle became one of history's great teaching moments, where a comprehensive defeat provided clear lessons for anyone willing to learn them. In the endless desert near Harran, the wind still blows over sand that once ran red with Roman blood. The Parthians are gone, their empire dust like Rome's, but the tactical principles demonstrated at Carrhae remain valid. Mobility matters, firepower matters, logistics matter, understanding your enemy matters more than courage or tradition. These truths, written in blood on the desert sand, endure across the centuries. That is the legacy of Carrhae.